I recently tested MDF versus plywood in 10 different ways. But some of you didn't like how I did the water testing, and so today I'm going to address that. I've also got 600 pounds of cement and a flamethrower. We're gonna see what happens. Now, there were a lot of great comments on that first video, but the ones around the water, some of them really stung inside. And I think I can sum them up with this one here. You totally missed the mark with the wet ability of MDF. Ouch. Plywood will dry out and not be ruined like swelled up, flaking MDF. And there were a bunch of comments that were all similar to that after MDF is wet, that it does not go back to the same shape and it is basically ruined, whereas plywood, when it dries out, is just fine. So we're gonna test that today. Here's how the first test is gonna go. I've got my 3 samples: MDF, maple plywood with a poplar core, and radiata pine. I also have samples that I have finished with 2 coats of Total Bolt Halcyon Clear. Now, you'll also notice some measurements on these, and that is the thickness of each of these pieces of wood when they were dry. And we're gonna make this scientific. I've got 12 ounces of water in each of these mason jars, and at the last minute, I thought, why not put some food coloring in there so maybe we can see the capillary action. So here we go. All right, I'm just gonna put these in here. Hopefully this doesn't overflow on my bench. I'm gonna come back in an hour and we'll get our first measurements. Now, the other big issue you guys had with the water test was that I didn't test the strength of the MDF after it had gotten wet. And a lot of people said, once it gets wet, it just breaks down the glue bonds of the MDF, and when it dries out, it is completely useless. So to test this out, I've got the same rig that I used last time, and it's just basically a mock-up of a 30-inch cabinet, and I've got a radiata pine shelf and an MDF shelf. And so I just load them in there and then put 80 pounds of weight on them and see how much it deflects. But this time it's gonna be a little bit easier to see because I got a little piece of acrylic and attached it to a wooden block because you need very scientific and accurate measuring devices. And then I marked the baseline of where the shelf sat with no weight on it. And then I added in the 80 pounds and marked it again to see how much it deflected. And so if I put the ruler behind here, we can see that the radiata pine in red deflected just under 1/8 of an inch, and the MDF over here in the blue deflected just over 1/8 of an inch. And that's exactly what we found the first time. But now we gotta expose these to water and figure out what happens. For the water exposure on these, I'm not gonna totally submerge it in water because I just don't think that's real world. But what might be real world is pink towels. Getting this with water, putting it on top, and making sure that I have a constant source of water on the top of it. Maybe like in the rain, or if you had a wet towel that you threw on top of some plywood. Not really sure why you do that, but maybe you did. So I'm gonna soak these in water and let them sit overnight. All right, this thing is completely saturated now. All the water is running off here, and I'm just gonna set this to the side. I will come back before I go to bed to make sure it is still wet, and then that way we'll have full exposure for the 24 hours. Of course, I'll do the MDF the same way and put it to the side. All right, and come back tomorrow. All right, it's been just over an hour since I dipped these in the Kool-Aid. Let's see what they're looking like. All right, looking at these dry ones first, you can see the 2 plywoods have really soaked up the water, whereas the MDF, it's coming up a little bit, but just barely over the water line. Now, looking at the ones with the Total Bolt Halcyon on it, you can see they're faring much better. It's not coming up the side at all. And then the MDF is looking, oh wow, look at that. It's barely even soaking into the face at all on this front part. I'm not gonna go into the gory details right now, but here are a few interesting observations that I've seen so far. And on the MDF, it is soaking way more up at the bottom than it is at the top, and it's just really mushrooming out, and that's because of those open fibers, I'm sure, at the bottom. And the unfinished radiata pine is already starting to fall apart and flake. This is kind of weird. It just expanded, and I don't think this is going to fare very well after another 23 hours. Pretty interesting stuff. I'm going to put these back in the jars. We'll come back tomorrow and see how they turned out. I think some of these are going to be a complete disaster. While we're waiting for the water to destroy some MDF, I wanted to do some extreme weight testing. And for that, I got the original rig and I put some gussets on it, and I put them on there with glue, some me-nails, and even some screws for some extra support. And if strength is measured by the amount of glue squeeze out, this thing should be a hoss. So I've got my 600 pounds of concrete. And yes, I know it's concrete and not cement. So for everybody who have already commented, that's concrete, not cement, you can go ahead and go change that to Brad. Thank you very much for your time and effort. So I started off with the MDF shelf that had the hardwood edge banding on the front because that was the strongest one from the last one. And as I started loading these bags on there, they're 50 pounds a piece, and stacked it up all the way to 300 pounds. Now at 300 pounds, there's about 3/16 of an inch deflection on that, and I started hearing some creaking in the jig in the setup. But 6 bags was about as high as I wanted to go, and so I took those off and then moved over to the radiata. But it was fine at the 200 and the 250, but as I got to the 300 pounds, this happened. Oh gosh. And so if you're thinking about using 300 pounds on shelf pins, maybe don't. So I took the jig over to the bench and I reinforced it with some solid wood cleats, and that should hold at least enough for the shelves to break before they do. Now there's one other thing that I also had to fix other than the jig. And by the way, the label now is right side up. That was really bothering me before. And I started loading it up, and it took the 300 pounds just fine, even though it was sagging quite a bit. Now I went back to the MDF with the hardwood front, and I took it all the way up to 600 pounds, and it was deflecting 5/16 of an inch, but it was really pretty strong. I removed everything, put the radiata pine in, and amazingly, that one made it to 600 pounds as well, although it did have a full 3/4 inch deflection on it. Then it was time for the MDF, and I put it in there, and I was really uncertain as I started stacking it up and getting to 400 and 500 pounds. It was sagging like crazy. So I added those last few bags on there, and to my amazement, it did not snap. It held to 600 pounds, even though it deflected 7/8 of an inch. At that point, I wanted to add some more weight, and I started having some pretty bad ideas. I kind of want to just make it fail. I've got those 2 dumbbells, but I also kind of don't want to destroy all my cameras. Where'd those things go? They're over here. This is a bad idea. I should not do this. Yeah, we're not doing that. I was pretty disappointed that I wasn't able to make it snap, and I'm sure you are too. So I'm gonna go back to the store, pick up another 400 pounds of concrete, and then we're gonna come back, and either this thing's gonna hold 1,000 pounds or it's gonna snap. But I gotta go get it, so we'll do that later in the video. And for all you data lovers and nerds like me, here is a chart of the weight and the deflections per shelf, so you can see how it progressed across there. And the biggest takeaway for me was just how strong that MDF with the hardwood edge banding was. It performed 3 times better than the MDF at the 600 pound weight, and usually over twice as good as the radiata pine. So if you're gonna be making a shelf, using MDF with hardwood edge banding is a great way to go. All right, we're back to the Kool-Aid test, and it's actually been maybe 26 or 27 hours, and I can already tell the MDF has not fared well. Right off the bat, after drying them off and measuring them, you can tell a huge difference between the unfinished and the finished. You can see how much more of that red dye that it really soaked in, especially on the MDF. That face of it, of the one with the halcyon, is still brown versus the deep red over here of the MDF. Same on the radiata, much less on the finished, and then a lot here. And then the maple actually held up really well with just the finish on it. You can also see on the finished one, it really held back the water running up the sides as well. Now I only put 2 coats of finish on these, and I know I didn't hit every little nook and cranny. So if that film finish is not perfect, water is much like life. And Jeff Goldblum has told us that.
Life finds a way.
The other big takeaway was just how much the MDF sucked up. You can see this is just mushroomed up, and it is just huge. So lots and lots of water in there, and we're just gonna have to see what happens when it dries, if it reduces down or not. All right, now I've got the shelves also, and these things stayed nice and wet. Oh yeah. So taking a quick look at these, kind of interesting. You can see exactly where the water is on the MDF, but on the radiata it is definitely spread out, and that's consistent with what we saw on the other test. The MDF is definitely raised up, and I can tell it has gained a little bit of water, but not that much, and it did not go all the way through, so that total penetration has not been there. And I think part of that is just because the face of MDF is more resistant to water absorption than the edges. But the radiata pine, man, look at the bow on that. It really has warped, which is what happens a lot with plywood, whereas MDF swells. And it's also soaked in a lot more on the edges on this one than the MDF. But those are just general observations. What we really want to know is the strength. So I'm going to let these dry out, and then we will put some weight on them and see if they deflect more than when they started. All right, so we've tested these against water and weight. But what about heat? I mean, this is a torture test, right? So I've got an iron here. I'm going to crank this thing up, and then we're going to start putting it on these samples and see what happens. I did some testing on these, and I put the iron down for 1 minute on one side and then 5 minutes on the other side on each of these to see what it would look like. And here's what I found. Now, after 1 minute, the two plywoods had barely any discoloration at all. You can just kind of tell where it was. Now, the MDF, on the other hand, definitely had discoloration where you can see exactly where that iron was. At the 5 minute mark, things got a little interesting. On the maple plywood, you can obviously see exactly where the iron was, but what's happened is the veneer is kind of bubbled up all around that heat. So that heat got into that thin veneer glue and has definitely messed with it. Now, the radiata pine is nice and smooth because it has that thick veneer, but you can definitely obviously see the discoloration and some of the charring and burning. Now, on the MDF, it is also nice and smooth, but obviously it is just a very much more pronounced. And when I pulled it up, I did get a little bit of smoking. Ooh, ooh, oh gosh. I love the smell of burnt MDF in the morning. Now, I wouldn't advise exposing any of these to heat, but you're going to get some pretty immediate discoloration on the MDF. And on the plywoods, they can hold up for some short term, but on the long term, especially on the thin veneer plywood, you're going to have an issue because those veneers are going to start separating. And I would say that the radiata pine held up the best out of all of them. But this is a torture test, and I think we need something stronger. All right, I was having a lot of fun out there with that flamethrower. I feel like Colin Furze out there or something. I was actually a little surprised that these things just didn't burst into flames, and when I stopped hitting them with the fire, they pretty much went out. But they are just all charred up, and especially the maple, that thin veneer, it's all just peeling up and crispy, and you've kind of got the crocodile skin on the radiata pine going on. And then the MDF looks like the Great Salt Flats. This is kind of like modern art over here. But that was all just for fun. Do not mix flame and wood. All right, we were back to the water test, and I let these dry under a heavy fan. The fan wasn't heavy, but the wind was heavy for 24 hours. And there's some really interesting results. So let's start with the MDF, and exactly what you guys said would happen did happen. It expanded, and then when it dried, it really didn't go back to that shape. And there's nice and flaky. You can see some voids that have actually formed in there. So I would absolutely say that this is completely unusable. Now, on the other hand, the plywood didn't really deform a whole lot, and really the maple plywood held up really well. It didn't separate at all. The radiata pine did have that part that started coming off, and it's got a huge warp to it now. A great way to think about it is MDF is like a sponge. It's going to soak up a ton of water, but it's not going to really travel very far along the material. Whereas plywood is more like a straw because the water will go through the fibers and it will really run down, and it can ruin a lot more of your product than it would with the MDF. And to recap everything, I have my TPS reports available. Let's check out a chart from them.
Did you see the memo about this?
So I've got all the samples listed out here and how much they grew in percent so that it's nice and level playing field. And you can see that the plywoods, they took up only about 4 to 6% after that 1 hour and 24 hours in the water. And after they dried, it actually came back down to just under where it was at an hour in the water. So it's definitely still going to be a little bit deformed, but not nearly as much as the MDF. Now, the MDF soaked up that red water just like the Kool-Aid man. It just got swole.
Oh, yeah.
Now, you can see the finished ones didn't reduce quite as much as the unfinished, and that's basically because they have a film finish holding that water in the same way it holds it out. And that finished MDF just kept growing and got all the way up to 30%. So you guys were absolutely right. That MDF is going to expand and then it's going to kind of stay that same size, whereas plywood is pretty close to what it was before it got wet. That's when they've been fully submerged. So let's take a look at the shelves and see what happens when the water's on the surface. All right, the shelves are dry, and the MDF, you can see the water exposure here, and it's rough and it's a little bit raised, but not anything like it was when you had it fully submerged. And I think, again, that's because of the face of the MDF resists water pretty well. And so this did not really swell up, and there's no separation in the sides. Now, on the radiata pine, you can't really tell much difference, although there is some staining here and there. The biggest thing with this one, it just really warped. And we'll probably see that when we put it in the test jig. Now, sure enough, that radiata board was bowed higher than before, and when I put it in the rig and marked it on the acrylic, it was actually about 1/16 of an inch of a bow higher. But oddly enough, that apparently made it stronger, and it resisted the weight more and only deflected around 1/16 of an inch versus closer to 1/8 of an inch before it got wet. On the other hand, the MDF actually sagged down a little bit, about 1/16 of an inch. but surprisingly, it deflected right about the same. They were both about 3/16 of an inch before being wet and then after being wet. So you're probably okay if you just have some surface water on MDF, as long as it doesn't get in there and you can really see that it's expanded and kind of broken down those bonds inside. All right, guys, this is the last chance to break some MDF, so I've got a much longer board. This one is 48 inches, and I also ripped up the old test rig and made it into some little makeshift stands. So I've got 1,000 pounds of concrete. Let's put it on here and see if we can get it to snap. I guess before I start throwing the concrete on here, I should stand on this and see if it breaks. Hopefully it doesn't. That would be anticlimactic, wouldn't it? I think this test rig should be fine. Didn't really mark the center of this. Look at that, I nailed it. While I'm loading this up, a big thank you to all of the folks joining the FTBT Builders Club. All right, here's 200 pounds. Oh, wow, this is sagging horribly more. We're not gonna get anywhere close to 1,000 pounds. All right, so this is 250. All right, 300 pounds, 350. Oh my gosh. Here we go, 400 pounds. Whew. I do not know if this is going to snap. All right, 450. Oh my gosh, that scared the crap out of me. All right, guys, we did it. And I'll show you that here in slow motion in just a second. But if you want to check out some other MDF versus plywood videos, you can check them out right there. And I'm gonna go change my shorts.